On the surface, Martin Scorsese's Hugo is a well-crafted and fun family adventure. But when we look further, it is a movie about cinema, and looks not only at the history of film, but also pushes the limits of what movies can do in the future. We are going to be looking at both of these elements before wrapping this video up by looking at how this movie is the accumulation of Martin Scorsese's entire career. At this point, I'm issuing you a spoiler warning, so if you have missed this movie, make sure you go check it out before watching this video. I also will be discussing some of the short films that are mentioned in this movie, so there's another spoiler warning for the 115-year-old short films in this film. I also highly recommend checking those out. But let's begin by looking at the history of film that is present in this movie. It's no secret, Martin Scorsese has been taking influence from classic cinema for decades. This scene from Raging Bull follows nearly the same editing pattern as this from Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. This shot that ends Goodfellas is a near exact copy from The Great Train Robbery, and you can find hints of classic movies throughout every Martin Scorsese movie that he's ever made. However, Hugo is dedicated to early cinema, and he does a lot more than just reference the era, but the movie itself has taken inspiration from the birth of cinema. The most obvious examples are when he takes shots from earlier films, like Hugo hanging from the clock tower is a clear reference to Safety Last. But the best ones aren't simple shots lifted and reincorporated into his movie, but techniques used in early movies that are reused in this film. For example, the earliest movies followed a 4-act structure as opposed to a 3-act structure that we see most frequently today. The movie that is most frequently referenced in Hugo is Melly's A Trip to the Moon, and that is a movie that is 4 acts. The first is this musical number which sets the tone for the movie, the next is the building and launch of the rocket ship, the third is people landing on the moon, and the fourth and final act is the climax in which people fight the monsters before making it back to Earth. And if we look at Hugo, we can see that it shares an almost identical narrative structure. The first act centers around the introduction of characters as we meet Hugo, the station inspector, and George Méliès. The second is when Hugo meets Isabelle and is able to put her key in his automaton. The third act is the reveal of who Méliès is, and that focuses on his films. And the final act is the climax in which Hugo is stuck on the clock tower in the ceremony to honor Méliès. Historically, Scorsese has always used a 3-act structure, as is standard with most movies. We usually see the introduction of characters when they're low in society, the characters starting to look up in life, before we usually see a fall from grace. But let's talk about what this means. In the past, he's used a 3-act structure to show the demise of a character, which really wouldn't go over nearly as well in a children's film. But besides that, it helps to speed up the pacing while slowing down the narrative. What I mean is that in a lot of Martin Scorsese movies, there's a lot of information jam-packed into a slower movie. It usually takes the plot a while to get from point A to point B, especially because his movies usually take place over many decades. But in this, because the emphasis is predominantly focused on the narrative and the characters as opposed to small changes in relationships, it helps make the plot advance faster, but also takes out a lot of the filler that makes his movies feel more realistic. But in this movie, realism wasn't the goal. It was instead to make a movie more accessible to general audiences. But he also did it to preserve the nature of the films that meant so much to him and influenced him so much. The film pays homage to the past of cinema, however, it also paves the way for the future by using new technologies. This is one of the best movies that utilized 3D technology to its full potential. In something like Avatar, we see branches thrown in our face and some pretty intense battle scenes, but the movie works just as well in 2D. But Hugo is a movie that is much better in 3D. It adds to the tone of the movie and helps supplement the major theme of art coming to life. Whether it be the automaton or some of Méliès's older films, this is a movie about bringing art into the modern world. And the element of 3D really makes us feel alive. It also helps bring us into the world. Scorsese has historically done a pretty good job at bringing his audience into his world. He usually uses a tracking shot like this one from Raging Bull or this one from Goodfellas. And he still does that in this movie with the incredible opening shot. But in addition to that, he's able to make this movie feel like it's moving because of the use of 3D. Unfortunately, YouTube does not have any 3D capabilities, but if you have a 3D TV, watch this movie on it and see how it comes to life. CGI is also used heavily in this movie. Remember this opening shot? Well, the majority of it is computer rendered. Some people may have a problem with that, but CGI is a very important tool for filmmakers, and Scorsese is able to utilize it to build up his world and make it even more impressive. For example, his use of CGI in conjunction with practical effects makes it work even better. Although this movie wasn't shot in an actual train station, there really was a big set to it, which was supplemented with green screens to CGI it all in later. And this set allows for actors to walk around freely, and the supplement of CGI allows it to look more natural and more realistic. Some of the philosophy in this film is also very interesting. Again, if we go back to his older movies, we can see that Scorsese often blurs the line between good and bad. We see our protagonist doing horrible deeds, and we begin to root for the bad guys. And the same is kind of true to this movie, at least to an extent. In the first act, we see two characters set up as the antagonist, the station inspector and George Melly. Melly catches Hugo and is somewhat mean to him and takes his notes. I mean, rightfully so, Hugo was trying to steal from him, but in this movie, he is still set up to be the antagonist.
Give me my notebook!
It's no longer your notebook, it is my notebook, and I'll do with it what I like. Maybe I'll just burn it!
However, that quickly changed as we get to know the character. We begin to see that he is more than just a character, he is a real, three-dimensional person. The same can be said about the station inspector. From the start, we really don't like him. He just seems to be a mean person trying to stop Hugo from doing anything. And this continues for the majority of the movie, up until the final act when we see him get redemption. He becomes more sincere, and eventually we see his side of the story. As I'm sure you've noticed, I've been referencing a lot of Scorsese's older movies when looking at this movie, which may be surprising. I mean, something as intense and violent as Taxi Driver or Casino, on surface value alone, could not be further from this family-friendly and good time movie. But when we look closer, this movie is heavily influenced by his older work. The themes of redemption, solitude, and hope are just as present in this as they are in some of his earlier titles. This movie was a turning point in his career. It paid homage to the movies that made the film industry what it is, but it also laid the foundation for thousands more movies to come with new technologies and different ways to tell a story, and Scorsese was really one of the frontrunners to really help bring this into the modern world for filmmaking. So those are my thoughts on Hugo. It's really one of my favorite movies by one of my favorite filmmakers. And there is a whole lot more to this movie, but that's my view on those specific elements. Leave a comment, tell me what you think about this movie, drop a like if you enjoyed, and subscribe so you can join me next time when we are going to discuss The Hateful Eight. A lot of contrast between these two movies. That video is going to be up next week and is on the right. On the left is my scene dissection of the film Whiplash. Make sure you check that out if you missed it. Thanks for watching.